As we are living through a pivotal moment in world history, the shift from a unipolar to a multipolar world, anti-imperialism is at the core of this global movement. As the U.S. is at the center of this global shift, how did anti-imperialism take hold in the U.S.? Let's find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they happen in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historical context in which these events take place. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they take place. This enables you to better understand and analyze the events that impact the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issues before us are the shift from a unipolar to a multipolar world. How is this happening and what does it mean? As well as the developing 2024 U.S. presidential political landscape. To help me work through these issues, let's turn to my guest. He's an author, independent journalist, political analyst, reporter for RT, and his latest book is entitled Out of the Movement to the Masses, Anti-Imperialist Organizing in America. And he's also the author of Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts. He is Caleb Maupin, my brother. Welcome back.
Sure. Glad to be here.
So, first of all, your thoughts on my introduction. Is that a hyperbole or is that a fairly accurate description of the dynamics that we find ourselves dealing with?
Trying to stop the rise of a multipolar world would be a lot like trying to stop the sun from rising in the morning, maybe trying to stop gravity. That's the way the world is moving. But our leaders are committed to trying to keep the world centered around Wall Street and London, and they are going to fail. The question is, how much of a cost in terms of human lives, in terms of the economy, in terms of political repression, are we going to have to endure before they come to the terms of reality, which is that we're going to have a world where there are other centers of power and countries trade with each other on a different basis. So I would agree with you.
And so as we look at this changing dynamic from the unipolar to the multipolar, we've got China, we have Russia, we have India. There are a number of countries that over the years have been targets of American sanctions regimes and all other types of pressure from the United States. With all of that, or from all of that, we now have the rise of the BRICS nations. We've got Brazil, we've got Russia, we've got India, we've got China, we've got South Africa, and now what about how many? I've lost track now. About 15 or 17 other countries that have joined this organization, this economic organization, which also seems to be an anti-imperialist organization.
Sure. I mean, if you understand imperialism in the economic sense, imperialism is a system rather than a policy, right? Kind of layman's terms, imperialism is when one country is mean to another country or attacks another country, but we're referring specifically to imperialism as an economic system, when the world is centered around financial institutions, trusts, cartels, and syndicates centered in the Western countries that dominate the world through the export of capital, sending their corporations all over the world to dominate the economies of developing countries, to hold back economic development, to keep countries as captive markets and spheres of influence. That process whereby countries are prevented from lifting themselves up, from electrifying, from building modern education systems, developing modern industries, developing their own economies, and just kind of used to dump the excess commodities of Western countries and have their economy, dominated by a foreign country and foreign monopolies and big corporations from another country, from the West. That process refers to that's what I mean when I say imperialism. I'm referring to a global economic setup. And that economic setup is on its way out. And that's been pretty clear. And a lot has gone on. Went on in the 20th century to kind of erode imperialism. And in the 21st century, imperialism continues to be in the decline. And there is this new economy rising around the world centered around the two Eurasian superpowers, Russia and China. They are kind of at the center, the linchpin of kind of a global network of countries, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba. But then there's even, other countries that are, willing to trade and are kind of, on the one hand, friendly to the United States, but on the other hand, are happy to work with Russia or China if they give them a better deal. The shape of global politics is changing. The world is changing. And this is just something we need to embrace. The world is not going to be centered around the West as it was for so long during the age of colonialism and since.
In fact, what we're finding out, I think the 27th and the 28th of August, Moscow is hosting the 6th annual, the 6th International Municipal BRICS Forum. And what might surprise a lot of people is there are delegations from 126 countries that are expected to take part, more than 5,000 participants from 500 cities around the world. This isn't getting very much attention or coverage here in the Western media, but folks need to understand, as we talked about the shift from the unipolar to the multipolar, this is a perfect example of that shift isn't happening. That shift has happened.
Sure. When I was at the Valdai Discussion Club in Sochi, Russia, in the mountains near the city, I saw Asil Toji, the head of the Norwegian Nobel Institute. And he pointed out that in the Eurasian subcontinent and outside of the Western countries, this is like a golden era. The amount of electrification that's going on, the amount of roads and railways that are being constructed. There is a whole exploding new economy happening in the world. And I saw that when I was at the Yalta Economic Forum in Crimea in 2018. And other people have seen it when they go to the Vladivostok Economic Forum in the Russian Far East. People have seen it with the Belt and Road Initiative and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that China is building. There is this whole new economy in the world now that is focused on development and growth, building power plants, building schools, building universities, building hospitals. And it's a really, really big part of the global economy. And our leaders are being very foolish by trying to just barricade it and blockade it and oppose it because they're locking the United States out of that economic growth. When somebody's growing economically, they have more money to spend, they have more products they can buy, and we could be benefiting from this new economy that's rising. But instead, our Western leaders are committed to maintaining their monopoly at all costs. And so we are getting locked out of an explosion of growth. It's just a very, very mistaken approach.
And I want to, with that intro, shift to your book, Out of the Movement to the Masses, Anti-Imperialist Organizing in America. Because as I said in the intro, one of the major elements, I believe, of this shift from the unipolar to the multipolar is anti-imperialism. And you write in the second paragraph of your introduction, what made the Communist Party USA important was that it was the first anti-imperialist organization to take hold in the country. There were certainly anti-war organizations such as Mark Twain's Anti-Imperialist League. There had been pacifists and socialists like Eugene Debs who opposed war on a class basis, but the Communist Party USA was founded on the ideological breakthroughs of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, specifically the teachings of Vladimir Lenin. So I wanted to use in this book, Out of the Movement to the Masses, which is a textbook, and wanted to start the conversation with what motivated you to write this book, and what motivated you to write this as a textbook?
Well, it's important to understand that I think the ultimate interest of we, the American people, is in a society free from imperialism. I don't think that helping ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and Chevron dominate the global oil markets really benefits American working people in the long run. There might be some short-term bonuses, but those things are fading. And that there is a long
short-term bonuses such as?
Well, we've had a higher standard of living, at least in the past, but that standard of living is in decline. And the future of the United States is not in this decaying Western financial system. It's in a new order where we're trading with countries on the basis of win-win cooperation. And the reason I wrote the textbook is because I wanted people to be aware of the fact that there has been a strong anti-imperialist movement in this country, and that we can learn from these struggles of the past and these organizations that existed and what they achieved as we figure out in our time how we can build an anti-imperialist movement to rescue our country from the nightmare of the emerging low-wage police state and the drive toward World War III. And I mean, really, you don't have anti-imperialism as we understand it, right? You don't have the rise of Russia and China. You don't have the BRICS. You don't have any of that without the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. That was a pivotal moment. That was a country that, you know, broke out of the Western imperialist system during World War I and started on an independent course of development. And, you know, it came out of, you know, the Bolsheviks started out as part of the Marxist movement. Marxism was the ideology of the labor movement, right? The worker versus the employer. But there was a division in the labor movement, increasingly between wealthy, you know, labor union bosses and higher paid skilled trade jobs that increasingly became supporters of empire and supporters of their country, colonizing, you know, countries in Africa and countries in Asia, et cetera, and the lower levels of the labor movement, of more oppressed workers. You know, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, was the big labor federation in the United States. And the people who started it, like Samuel Gompers, they were socialists or Marxists, but they were not anti-imperialists. And by the time World War I came along, the AFL was a union that largely was for whites only. Most of the unions that were part of it banned black people from joining, banned people not born in the United States from joining, banned people who did not speak English as their first language from joining. And they were big supporters of World War I when it happened. And that there was a divide in the labor movement. And Marxism, that had been the ideology of the labor movement, got very much divided. And you had parties like, you know, the British Labour Party is the ruling party of Britain today. It originated as a Marxist party of labor organizers, but it became a pro-imperialist party. Well, Bolshevism and the people who took power in Russia, the Bolsheviks, they were a breakaway from the Marxist movement that had developed this new theory of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And they said, we're not just fighting against regular capitalism, we're fighting against the monopolistic capitalism of Britain and France and Germany and America. And that, you know, that means that we support nations, right? Originally, Marxists in the labor movement said there are no nations. Workers of the world unite. It's just the workers versus the bosses, no borders in our struggle. Well, Lenin says, actually, we do support nations in their fight against imperialism. And after the Bolsheviks took power in Russia, one of the first things they did is they called a conference in Baku in Azerbaijan. And at that conference, they invited all kinds of people from all over the world. And they said, we will support you as long as you're fighting imperialism. And one of the people that came to that conference and was given military support by the Bolsheviks was the Emir of Afghanistan. And the Emir of Afghanistan was a conservative monarchist. He was not a Marxist, not a socialist of any stripe. He was a conservative monarchist, a very conservative Muslim. But the Bolsheviks said, you're fighting imperialism, and so are we, and so we support you. And he gave them support. And many people around the world were inspired by the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist message that the Bolsheviks had, which was kind of a breakaway from the standard Marxist movement. The understanding was we're not just fighting capitalism, we're fighting against imperialism. And we support nations and colonized people of all different classes, workers, capitalists, whoever, who are struggling against imperialism. That is the basis of this new movement that we are trying to build. And the Communist Party of the United States was the incarnation of that movement. And that's why it was embraced by many different sections of the population, most especially the black community in America, because they viewed black people as a colonized people, an oppressed nation within U.S. borders. Marcus Garvey had been leading the black nationalist movement in the United States, the Back to Africa movement, and many black people saw African Americans as a colonized people within the U.S. borders, and the Communist Party agreed with that. And that was a winning point that they had with many people in the United States. And, you know, the Communist Party was supportive of anyone around the world who was struggling against British, American, or French imperialism.
And as we look at that history and we bring it forward to the current moment and the Russia-phobia that we find ourselves subjected to, I submit, and please, if I'm wrong, correct me, that one of the things that's at the crux of this Russia-phobia is the fact that America is an imperialist nation and a neo-colonial power, and Russia has, the Soviet Union and then into Russia, has been anti-imperialist, anti-colonialism, which is one of the reasons why we find now Russia gaining so much traction with countries on the continent of Africa.
Well, I got to tell you, just a few weeks after the special military operation in Russia began a couple years ago, I was in New York City with 10 or 15 of my friends, and we were marching around with American flags and Russian flags, chanting, "Russia is not our enemy. Russia is not our enemy." And we chanted this in Union Square, and then we went up to Grand Central Station. We marched around Grand Central Station chanting that. And while we were doing that, we got thumbs up from a lot of different people. Now, many people did not agree with us, but the people who did give us thumbs up, many of them were people that were not from the United States. New York City is a big, international center. You have the United Nations that's there. You have Wall Street that's there. And I would say the majority of the people who gave us thumbs up and gave us support were from the continent of Africa. They were people from West Africa, from Nigeria. They were people from South Africa. And that, the economy of Africa is very tied in with the Russian economy. And Russia provides fertilizer to many countries. Russia has partnerships with many countries to help them develop their state-run mining industries or their state-run oil and natural gas industries. So support for Russia on the African continent is widespread. Now, this doesn't match the narrative of liberals. Liberals would have us believe that Russia is a white supremacist country, and that's why they rigged the elections in 2016 to get white supremacist Donald Trump elected. And that just does not match reality. The Soviet Union, which modern Russia is built on the foundations of, the Soviet Union was the best friend of anti-colonial and liberation movements on the African continent. And those relationships still exist. When I was in Russia, I sat down with people from various African countries. I sat down with people from Namibia. Well, the ruling party of Namibia is the Southwest African People's Organization, which was a Soviet-aligned, Soviet-funded organization that fought for Namibia to become independent. The ruling party of South Africa, the African National Congress, was armed and funded by the Soviet Union. If you go to Ghana, right, the man who created modern Ghana was Kwame Nkrumah, who was a big friend of the Soviet Union and called himself an African socialist and developed his own interpretation of the Marxist philosophy that was specific to the African continent. There was Julius Nyerere. There was Gaddafi, who built, Libya into the most prosperous country on the African continent. There are just so many examples of how Russia is intimately tied in with the struggle against colonialism on the African continent, with the struggle of African countries to pursue their own course of development. And that is rooted in the foundation of the Bolshevik Revolution and the Bolshevik ideology, which I will emphasize was a break with the standard Marxist view. Marx, himself, he believed that the first communist revolution would happen in Germany, and it would be the European countries that had the communist revolution first because they were the most advanced. And it was Lenin who came along and said, well, actually, that's wrong. The center of revolutionary energy is going to be in the colonized and oppressed countries of the world. And the working class in the imperialist homeland is largely being bought off. And it's going to be the division between what we now, some academics talk about the global north and the global south. It's going to be that division that brings socialism into the world. And that is kind of the defining aspect of what Lenin taught. And as much as the global anti-imperialist movement is not explicitly Marxist-Leninist in the Soviet sense, they don't exactly follow that Soviet ideology. That understanding of imperialism and what happened in the 20th century with the Soviet Union, with later the Chinese Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, all of that laid the basis for what exists today. And that understanding is important. And that's why I wrote this textbook.
And to your point about all of these myths and stories and fictions about Russia being involved in our election and all of this other foolishness. Mark Zuckerberg just wrote a letter to Jim Jordan saying that he apologizes for having purged stories from Facebook regarding the Hunter Biden laptop and some of the other stories, because he has now come to understand that that whole narrative was not Russian propaganda, as the FBI had told him. He now has come to understand that those stories are true. And I bring that up just as one data point to demonstrate how so much of this rhetoric that we've been hearing, so much of this propaganda that we've been hearing about China being involved in our elections and Russia being involved in our elections and Iran. Mark Zuckerberg, the head of Facebook, just sent a letter to Jim Jordan laying all this out, that it was BS. It was a fiction created by the FBI. Caleb Maupin.
Well, we've been through this before. You know, right after the Russian Revolution, just a few years later in London, in Britain, there was a scandal called the Zinoviev letter. And the British people were told, oh, my goodness, the Russians are meddling in our elections. They're trying to get the Labour Party to win the election. And Lloyd George, who was the conservative military leader, was playing up the idea that the Labour Party was being funded and supported by Russia. And they held up this piece of paper they said was the smoking gun. It was the proof. The Zinoviev letter, this letter supposedly from the Russian government official of Zinoviev to the Labour Party. Well, it was later proven to be a complete hoax. It was fake, right? But that was happening back in the 1920s, and we've been through this over and over and over again. When Henry Wallace ran for president, he was the vice president under Roosevelt, and then when Truman was president, he ran against the Democrats as they became a pro-war party, the party that was leading us into the Korean War, et cetera. He ran as an independent candidate in 1948, and they claimed his campaign was a big Russian conspiracy, and it was a communist conspiracy. There's a whole history of this. And the FBI, if you look at the number of investigations they've done into supposed Russian influence in American elections, it's endless, but it's always a hoax, right? American elections happen because of events in America, not because of Russia. However, there is no question that many people in the United States do want peace, and they do want peace with the Soviet Union or with modern Russia. And they may vote for candidates who they think are more likely to bring about that peace. But that's not a conspiracy. That's doing what you're supposed to be able to do in a democracy, expressing yourself at the ballot box. And what they're really worried about is Americans thinking wrong. They're really worried about not having a monopoly over the information that we receive. They're really worried about us questioning what we're told and not marching in lockstep behind their agenda of war and dividing the world into blocks and isolating certain countries. And this story has happened over and over and over again in American politics. We've been through it so many times.
And final point on this, and I want to get back to the book. As you just said, events happen in American elections due to America. Well, all of this Chicken Little, the sky is falling and the world is interfering in our elections. Well, there was a story in the New York Times about 3 months ago about AIPAC spending $100 million to unseat what they consider to be left-leaning Democrats whose position on Israel was not consistent with the Zionist ideology. I'm going to say that again. This was in the New York Times. I'm not making this up. This isn't anti-Semitic dialogue. This is New York Times. AIPAC spending $100 million on primary campaigns to remove Democrats that they consider to be anti-Israeli. That's what happened in New York with Jamal Bowman. That's what happened in Missouri with what's her name? I think she's in St. Louis. The Congresswoman, I'm drawing a blank on her. Anyway, and they were successful in a number of campaigns. So we're running around chasing ghosts, chasing Russian ghosts and Chinese ghosts, when the real culprits are telling you right up front in the New York Times what it is they're doing and why it is they're doing it. With that being said, you can either respond to that or how did you organize your textbook, and why is it organized in the manner in which it is?
Well, I went over like case studies of 3 different anti-imperialist movements or organizations in the United States. I started with probably the most successful, which was the Communist Party of the United States, which at one point, had a huge amount of influence. During the Roosevelt administration, they entered an alliance with Roosevelt. And in the late 1930s, the Communist Party controlled 2 of the city council seats in New York City. They had a very close ally in the U.S. Congress representing Harlem, named Vito Marcantonio. They also had a member of Congress in Minnesota who was their friend and ally and read their newspaper into the congressional record. They had meetings at the White House with President Roosevelt on multiple occasions. Members of the Communist Party or the Young Communist League were brought to the White House to meet with Roosevelt. And they led the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was a new labor federation they had created as an alternative to the American Federation of Labor. And they were a very influential group in the labor movement, among intellectuals, in Hollywood, and they put forward an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist message, and their successes are worth studying. There were certainly mistakes that were made, and they were very brutally crushed by the FBI in the aftermath of the Second World War with the rise of McCarthyism, but they're worth studying. Then from there, I talked about the Workers' World Party, which was a Marxist-Leninist political party that really came into prominence in the late 60s and really kind of peaked in its influence during the 1980s. And they were a party that took inspiration not just from the Soviet Union, but from the wave of anti-colonial movements that emerged. They were sympathetic to Libya and Gaddafi. They were sympathetic to North Korea and others. And they did a lot of very important anti-war organizing, building anti-war coalitions. They were very close to Ramsey Clark, the former U.S. Attorney General who left the Lyndon Johnson administration and became an international lawyer and an opponent of the International Criminal Court in his final years and such. And then I talked about the new communist movement of the 1970s, which was a number of different organizations that emerged during the 1970s that were trying to take inspiration from China. They wanted to take guidance from the Chinese Revolution. China had argued that the Soviet Union had kind of abandoned the global anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggle. They felt it was holding back revolutionary forces, but China was at that point presenting itself as a bastion of anti-imperialism. And so there were a number of new political parties formed during the 1970s that modeled themselves on China. And all 3 of these case studies, all 3 of these groups made big mistakes, but also had big successes. The most successful was the Communist Party prior to it being crushed by the FBI during the McCarthy period. All of them had big successes and were able to do big, important things. And I studied all of them. And then from there, the 4th chapter talked about divisions in the ruling class. And, why is it that we see at this point, we're seeing a big all-out fight between Donald Trump and those who oppose him. And, when you talk about the Watergate scandal and you talk about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, what was really going on behind closed doors? And then in the final chapter, I tried to kind of take from all of that, what we could take and what we could learn when trying to build a movement in our time. One thing I made a point of doing in the book is that every chapter is accompanied by a number of original texts from the period discussed. I have a number of texts from the Communist Party, from the Workers' World Party, from the new communist movement of the 1970s, so that we can hear from the horse's mouth, so to speak, what these people were preaching and what they believed as they were building their organizations.
So how does this history, how relevant is this history? You just mentioned Donald Trump. How relevant is this history to where we find ourselves today with our politics?
I would argue it's extremely relevant. And if you look at Roosevelt and who opposed him, and if you look at, the Kennedy assassination, and if you look at the Watergate scandal, there has always been a divide among the American elite between, what you can call the Eastern establishment, the ultra rich, the ultra monopolies, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the Carnegies that are now at this point aligned with Silicon Valley, the tech monopolies, Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and others. There's always been a divide between these entrenched ultra monopolies and a lot of lower level rich people who are not part of the club and feel that those entrenched monopolies are kind of rigging things against them. And I quote, there's a very good text called The Anglo-American Establishment by Carroll Quigley that talks about this divide. I think he was one of the first people to talk about it. But then from there, you also have a great book by Carl Oglesby called The Yankee and Cowboy War, that talks about this and specifically applies that analysis to what went on with the Watergate scandal, with the assassination of JFK and the political crisis of the 1960s and 70s. And I would argue that in our time, this is the fight that kind of defines things. And when we talk about trying to build a movement against colonialism and imperialism in the United States, these lower level capitalists would gain if America had paved roads, if America had a stronger economy, and if we were doing business with the countries around the world that are growing right now in alliance with China, right? If we were trading with them and some of that wealth was flowing into our economy, we would be benefiting. However, it is the ultra monopolies that are very much tied in with the intelligence apparatus, the people who brought us Henry Kissinger, the people who brought us Zbigniew Brzezinski. They are determined to keep the United States at the top and keep Western imperialist, this financial system at the top of the world at all costs, even if that means kind of, playing a long geopolitical game. And if it means dramatically decreasing the standard of living and kind of collapsing the domestic economy of the United States. And so when Trump talks about America first and his supporters rail against globalists, this is really what they're getting at, is the lower levels of capital are fighting against the Eastern establishment. And that creates an opening for those of us who want to build an anti-imperialist movement in this country to intervene. And I talk about that. And unfortunately, it seems like, really since the 1970s and since kind of the end of the 1960s and 70s political upsurge, much of the left has kind of just deteriorated into being the foot soldiers of that Eastern establishment. They see those lower level capitalists as being the most hawkish and warlike, as being the most anti-union and the most authoritarian. So they think, okay, we're going to align with these, with the Eastern establishment against them. And I argue that that's not the correct approach, because right now it is those lower level capitalists who feel threatened. And it is among them that you found support for Julian Assange, that you find interest in being friendly with Russia and with China and anti-establishment sentiment. You find opposition to the tech monopolies and their censorship. And that really we're in a period where those of us who are anti-imperialists need to pivot into trying to build an anti-monopoly coalition. And that's what the Communist Party talked about at the end of the Second World War, as the Cold War got going, as they were being crushed by the FBI. They said their goal was to build an anti-monopoly coalition, to unite with the working class, the small business owners, even some of the wealthy, against the big monopolies and their drive for war. And I would argue that's what we should be aiming to do in our time, is build an anti-monopoly coalition. And that's what I've pulled from that textbook and from that history, going over what has been done and what has been successful. And that, the Communist Party really gained from having an alliance with Roosevelt. That was very strategic on their part. And I would argue that similar alliances are necessary. But the main thing is that there needs to be a network of people that are committed to building anti-imperialist politics in America. We need a network of people who can work together, who can rely on each other, and can effectively carry out anti-imperialist operations. And, there are examples of this. I'm about to go to Florida to support the Uhuru movement. The Uhuru movement, the African People's Socialist Party, they are an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist organization, and they're doing it. And if you go to St. Louis, Missouri, and if you go to St. Petersburg, Florida,
Cori Bush, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
her name, you said St. Louis. Cori Bush, sorry, is the other congresswoman that was defeated sorry, I had to get it out. Go ahead.
Okay. But you will see the huge community centers that they've built, the farmers markets that they've built. That they have built a base among, the African-American community in these two cities where they are providing services to people while teaching an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist ideology. Now, I don't necessarily agree with their entire approach on everything, but I see why they're being targeted, because they are laying the foundations of building a broader anti-imperialist movement. And what they are doing is a great model to look at. They are building a base among the population. The title of the book is Out of the Movement to the Masses. Like, I've been going to anti-war protests and I've been going to socialist and communist spaces, and very rarely did I ever encounter the African People's Socialist Party. but they were organizing where it counted, not in these kind of obscure academic bohemian spaces. They were organizing in communities, and they were providing real services, and they were building community centers and, you know, having classes for pregnant mothers and having organic farmers markets. And they were doing things among the masses of people, not among the so-called movement of people that like to read books about communism or whatever. And that is why they are being targeted, because they are actually building the kind of movement that needs to be done. They're doing what the Communist Party did during the 1930s. They're doing what the new communist movement of the 1970s attempted to do and was pretty unsuccessful because of, you know, global circumstances, etc. They are doing what needs to be done to build a real anti-colonial movement. And that's kind of what I'm urging in the text, is we have to have a reevaluation, and we have to figure out how we can reach the bulk of the American people and not confine ourselves to kind of left academic and intellectual spaces.
Is it too simplistic to, when you look at this battle between the elites, is it too simplistic to categorize it as the financialists versus the industrialists?
Yes, it's a little bit too simplistic, because there is a lot of financialization, right? A lot of the lower levels of capital
they're concentric circles.
Yeah. I mean, it's not exactly right, but you're pointing to a certain trend, right? That there is one faction that favors economic growth, because economic growth will mean more money for them. There's another faction that is not concerned about economic growth so much as they are concerned about maintaining their monopoly. And in order to maintain their monopoly, they need to slow down growth around the world, and they're actually pushing degrowth or slow growth economics. So that's probably the primary divide, is pro-growth and anti-growth, right? You would think that every businessman would be pro-growth, but the ultra monopolies that are heavily involved in finance, at this point, they are blatantly talking about degrowth as a way to stay at the top.
In fact, one of the ways that they maintain their position is through consolidation. One of the ways that the banks control their monopoly is by buying smaller banks and bringing that's just one example.
Sure. I mean, we live in a time where at the end of the day, the issue is technology, is that it is human labor that creates all wealth, right? It is only human labor that creates value at the end of the day. And it is the value that workers create that lays the basis for the profits that capitalists can make, et cetera. And we are in a period where the technological revolution is reducing the role of workers at the assembly line. There's a lot of jobs that are no longer in existence because of technological advancement. And in a rational society, that would be great. But in our society where profits are in command, that's leading to an economic crisis. Great example is self-driving cars. Self-driving cars should be a great thing. It should be great that this job called driving, this chore, this human labor of driving cars is no longer necessary. But if they introduce self-driving cars, you would immediately in this country have millions of truck drivers unemployed, millions of Uber drivers unemployed, millions of traffic court employees unemployed. You would have riots in the streets. And Andrew Yang talked about how if, self-driving cars came to the United States, we would have a society-wide crisis of unemployment and chaos like we've never seen. How is that rational? Why should technological advancement lead to greater poverty? And that is the problem that we are facing. Human creativity and brilliance has outstripped the narrow limits of production organized to make profit. We need a rationally planned economy so that economic growth can continue and technological advancement leads to greater prosperity for all. And, if you want
China.
Yeah. And China by controlling their economy and by having the state assign credit based on their 5-year plans and having, state-controlled tech corporations that are in line with the Communist Party's vision, they're able to continue having growth despite having technological advancement. And that's ultimately what we need to have. And that is what Marx wrote about. One of the writers I quote extensively from is a brilliant thinker from the new communist movement named Nelson Peary. And his autobiography, Black Radical, which is very good, talks about his involvement in the Communist Party and then getting kicked out of the Communist Party and FBI infiltration of the Communist Party and then starting the Communist Labor Party during the 1970s, but also his very important book that he published before before he died, I believe in 2004, called The Future is Up to Us, which really gets into this contradiction of technology leading to impoverishment. And he's saying this like during the Bush administration, before AI, before any of what we're saying now. He's laying out how this is going to lead to a big economic crisis that's going to necessitate a new economic system. Nelson Peary is a brilliant thinker who had this kind of understanding. I also draw from Fred Goldstein, from Sam Marcy, from some of the other writers who said the same thing. But this has always been kind of the understanding, is that technological advancement should not lead to impoverishment. It should lead to greater prosperity. You know, I often quote, there's an old story called the coal miner's riddle. The coal miner, he's sitting in his house with his son. The son says, "Father, why is it so cold in the house?" And he says, "Because I can't afford to buy any coal." And he says, "Well, why can't we afford to buy any coal?" And he says, "Because I lost my job at the coal mine. I was laid off." And he says, "Father, why were you laid off from the coal mine? Why did you lose your job?" He says, "Because there is too much coal." That's capitalism, but that's not rational. It's poverty created by abundance. I keep hearing our politicians talk about a housing shortage. Have you heard this? A housing shortage in America. There's no housing shortage. I live in New York City. There's 4 empty apartments for every homeless person. There's millions of empty houses. There's no housing shortage in America. There's a shortage of affordable housing because we have an irrational economic system.
BlackRock bought up a lot of the housing stock, and instead of putting those houses back on the market, they held those homes off the market and then put them out for rent. So in many instances, it's not a matter of, $25,000 credit to those first-time home buyers, allegedly to lower the price of housing or to make housing more affordable. No, all that's going to do is raise the price of houses by $25,000. What you need to do is get that housing stock that BlackRock has bought up and put that on the market, make that available. Because if you look at the Econ 101 supply and demand, you put more houses on the market, chances are the price of houses is going to decline.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, when we talk about imperialism and we talk about anti-imperialist movements, one great example is the situation with Yemen, right? Yemen right now, this is one of the poorest countries in the world. And right now, this country, it has a big movement called the Houthis, or Ansar Allah, they're shaking the world. But if you go and listen or read the sermons of the founder of the Houthi movement, Hussein al-Houthi, what he's fighting for is economic development, because he points out that Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the world, but yet it has a huge amount of oil. It has a huge amount of arable land to grow food, but the people there are very, very poor. And the Houthi movement that, is now at this point stopping ships in the Mediterranean and standing with the Palestinians and sending drones to the Indian Ocean and just shaking the world. That was a movement of very, very poor people in one of the poorest countries in the world that, demanding to take control of their natural resources and take control of their economy. My understanding of imperialism and such very much had a lot to do with the fact that in 2015, I participated in a humanitarian mission attempting to deliver medical aid to Yemen after, the upsurge of 2015, when the Houthi movement and their revolutionary committee took power. I went on a ship from the Islamic Republic of Iran with the Red Crescent Society, and we tried to deliver medical aid to Yemen, and we were blocked in doing so. And reading about this anti-colonial movement that was formed in Yemen, a very religious Shia Muslim movement, demanding economic development, demanding taking control of their resources. Reading about that was very inspiring in, the aim of building an anti-colonial and anti-imperialist movement in the United States. And now to see what the Houthis are doing as they're blocking ships to support the Palestinians, as they're withstanding U.S. attack. I mean, this is a movement of impoverished people fighting for their economic development and fighting to build a new country. This is a mass anti-colonial movement that is worth studying. And the fact that they align themselves with Russia and China, they're not blocking ships from Russia. They're not blocking ships from China. They are blocking ships from Israel and any country that trades with them. That kind of shows you that this global anti-imperialist movement that is about mobilizing millions of people to fight for their rights, this global anti-imperialist movement has a real strength.
let's shift now to the 2024 presidential election. We've come out of the Republican convention. We've now come out of the Democratic convention and the Democratic Party convention. And Donald Trump was shocked when Joe Biden stepped down, Kamala Harris stepped in. That has changed the dynamic, at least in terms of the dialogue, and we're starting to see some shift in the numbers. Your thoughts on where we are now with this landscape?
I think that Kamala Harris is a completely manufactured candidate. She was created by the people who brought us the Hillary Clinton State Department. When it was made clear that Hillary Clinton couldn't run for president once again in 2020, all of Hillary Clinton's financial backers put their money behind Kamala Harris. She was not popular with the American people, but yet powerful forces twisted Joe Biden's arm and put her on the ticket as VP. She has not been popular or successful as VP, but she is the candidate that the forces that are committed to regime change and all-out efforts to oppose Russia and China at all costs, she is the one that they have invested the most in supporting. And I don't think she's going to win. I think that Trump will win the upcoming election. And that doesn't mean everything about Trump is good or I endorse Donald Trump. I'm just telling you that I think Trump is going to win. But I also believe that there are very powerful forces that see Kamala Harris as their best bet at getting what they want, which is more regime change wars, more destabilization around the world. I did write a book in 2020 about Kamala Harris 4 years ago. And I thought it was very odd that right after she got the Democratic nomination, this book that had been on sale for 4 years on Amazon suddenly got removed from Amazon. And for 7 days, my book was banned from Amazon and then restored with no explanation 7 days later. I thought that was very, very odd. It raised a lot of eyebrows, but it also points to the amount of power the tech monopolies really have. It seems like everything was being done to support Kamala Harris. What I also thought was interesting is that in my book, I talked about Tulsi Gabbard and how Tulsi Gabbard kind of represents forces in the Pentagon that are really worried about another Arab Spring and what Kamala Harris and the Hillary Clinton State Department, forces, people like Samantha Power, people like Anne-Marie Slaughter, what they might engineer if they come back to office. My book highlighted Tulsi Gabbard as being kind of a faction that is opposed to Kamala Harris. And the very same day that my book was pulled from Amazon, Tulsi Gabbard was added to the Quiet Skies terrorism watch list by the American government. When she tried to board a plane, she found out she was accused of being a terrorist. And I thought that was interesting as well. And it just kind of points to, and there was all kinds of weird stuff going on in terms of social media and Google searches that was being manipulated around that time. But the book that I wrote about Kamala Harris and who has backed her and the ties that she has getting pulled from Amazon, it was interesting to see the timing.
The position of the Democratic Party as it relates to Gaza. And I was at the DNC. I was also at the RNC conventions. But there were protesters in Chicago demanding a change in U.S. policy as it relates to the genocide in Gaza. Then you had uncommitted delegates that were able to have a sit-in at the DNC right outside the front door, the entrance to the United Center, demanding that a pro-Palestinian spokesperson be added to the speakers list. And none of that was agreed to. In fact, it was basically dismissed summarily. So your thoughts on the dangers that the Democrats are playing with taking that position as it relates to the general election?
Well, if the Democrats are going to win this election, they're going to need lots of votes in Minnesota, lots of votes in Wisconsin, and lots of votes in Michigan. And what do all three of those states have in common? Those swing states?
Arab populations.
That's right. Lots of Muslim Americans, lots of Arab Americans. And with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris giving a blank check to Israel to do what they are doing, I think it's very unlikely to see those folks, lining up to vote for them. Now, Kamala Harris has made some noise about this or that, but she's basically the president already. If she was going to do something, she could do it right now. I mean, she's the vice president, but Joe Biden doesn't seem to be as actively involved in the political running of the country as some people might expect. That said, I will say that Donald Trump, I mean, his position on Israel-Palestine, I mean, is pretty reprehensible. And he continues to play up the idea that Kamala Harris and the Democrats are somehow anti-Israel, which they are not. What I think is interesting, though, and I noticed that it seems like anti-Israel voices in the Trump camp, they may not be on the front stage, but they do have a lot of influence. And I'm not saying all these people are doing what they're doing for necessarily good reasons. But I noticed when Elon Musk was interviewing Donald Trump, in the chat, it just exploded. And all over Twitter, it exploded the phrase, "No war on Iran." That came from Nick Fuentes. Now, Nick Fuentes is somebody that I, don't agree with on many, many things and find a lot of his views and just his presentation style to be kind of reprehensible and gross. But he, for his own reasons, says no war with Iran. I also noticed that Candace Owens, who is, a conservative and was very pro-Israel at one point, she was not pro-Israel enough. Now she's kind of moved for interesting reasons that are very different than anything I would say. She's moved into an anti-Israel direction. And she has also got a lot of people in the Trump camp who listen to her. And she is making noise, no war in Iran, and urging Trump supporters not to support Israel. And this points to the fact that opposition to Israel, I think, is much more widespread in both parties than anyone wants to recognize. It's an element of the emperor has no clothes. Both parties pretend that everyone in their camp just supports Israel. But anyone who talks to a typical Democrat, you were at the Republican convention and the Democrat convention, and you could probably confirm that opposition to what Israel is doing is boiling beneath the surface amid both political parties and amid all sections of this country, and that there is a lot of growing outrage about the influence and power of Israel in American politics, even among people who might support Israel otherwise, but just don't appreciate the arrogance and grip that they seem to have over policy making.
And some people just help me understand why, but some people just have a problem with genocide. It's a bit odorous. There are growing groups, Republicans for Harris, and there are those who are positing that this is because she's a stooge of the elite, and this represents how she, who's truly backing her. What about the argument that many of those in those types of organizations see her as an opportunity to reclaim the Republican Party by getting rid of Donald Trump? And it's almost any port in a storm kind of mentality. They see her as the stalking horse. If they can back her, if she can defeat Trump, they then can the old school, the traditional Republicans can regain control of their party. What say you, Caleb Maupin?
Well, I would say that, the Bush era Republican Party is gone. It's never coming back. And Donald Trump is a symptom of that. And that's very clear. And that Donald Trump's recent, embracing of Tulsi Gabbard and RFK, that indicates that Donald Trump is taking his campaign in an anti-establishment direction. Now, that doesn't mean that he's going to necessarily do good things as president. That just means that he's increasingly realizing that his appeal is to people that are opposed to the establishment. And I think that means the establishment is going to fight him a lot harder. There's no question about that. And that, there are your regular, traditional, neoconservative Republicans, my country, right or wrong. If you don't like it here, move to some other country, support, the military, support the wars, support, America, dominating the world and showing the world about our great American way of life. Those folks are increasingly finding the Republican Party to not be their home. And this is all very interesting. I noticed in Kamala Harris's DNC speech, she attacked the Republicans for, quote, denigrating America. And that made me smile, because it reminded me of what I always heard about the far left, right? It was the far left. They hate America. They're always saying things are bad. Why are you always running down our country? And a lot of things that Kamala Harris said in her speech almost sounded like neoconservatism. She attacked Donald Trump for meeting with Kim Jong-un. She said he was cozying up to tyrants and being friendly with tyrants. And it seemed to me like there was very much, the Republican Party, I believe, over time is going to become more of a catch-all populist anti-establishment party, whereas the Democratic Party is more and more becoming the party of the establishment, of the way, things are quote unquote supposed to be. I think that what I would call the late Cold War normal in American politics is being flipped. It used to be the Republican Party was the party of the establishment, and the Democrats were the party of opposition, not very sincere opposition in many cases, but they were the party of, if you didn't agree with what you're supposed to think necessarily, if you're a little more critical, you become a Democrat.
Well, if you were pro-civil rights, if you were pro-environment, if you were anti-war, that's where you went.
Yeah, and I think it's being flipped. And that doesn't mean that Republicans and the MAGA base that are talking a certain way are sincere at all. That just means who they're appealing to. The Republican Party has an anti-establishment appeal more and more every day. The Democratic Party has a pro-establishment appeal. And I think this Republicans for Harris is a great example of that.
So as we move now spiraling towards November 5th, you've already said you believe that Donald Trump is going to win the election. One of the things that I find very, very telling, and I check it every day, when you go to the Harris website, there's still no policy positions stated. There's no policy tab. When I asked that question a couple of times at the DNCC, I was told, "Oh, you don't understand. She hasn't had time. There hasn't been." I said, "Wait a minute. She ran for president 4 years ago, so she had to have we hope she had established some policy positions as a candidate. She was the vice president going on 4 years now. We hope during those 4 years she could have figured out some policy, and it's now been almost a month. You can't tell me that she couldn't pick up the phone and call a bunch of people in the room and say, 'Hey, I need policies on education, on defense, on the economy, on these 5 positions. I need policy in 10 days. Go get it done.'" Caleb Maupin.
Well, I think there are 3 possible outcomes for the election. In my mind, probably the worst case scenario would be Kamala Harris winning. And I think that would be followed by a number of, there'd be chaos in the streets. A lot of Trump supporters will not accept it as a legitimate election. And I expect there will then be a big crackdown on dissent. And I expect there'll be a lot of provocations, et cetera, and that will be used by the establishment to kind of crack down on dissent.
Wait a minute. And people need to understand the crackdown on dissent has already started by looking what's being done to who's being deplatformed from social media sites. Look at what's happening to folks who are getting arrested. The guy that started Instagram and all of these folks, the Uhuru 3, Scott Ritter, your book taken off of all of these things are data points to support your position that the crackdown on dissent has already started.
No, I mean, the Biden administration has already indicted Sue Terry, who was the top advisor to Obama and Bush on South Korea. And I mean, the fact that she's been indicted as a foreign agent of South Korea, I mean, just because South Korea wants to have better negotiations with North Korea, I mean, it looks like blatant retaliation.
And South Korea is an ally.
Yeah, their closest friend in Washington, D.C., Sue Terry, has now been accused of being a foreign agent. She's facing decades in prison. I mean, this is craziness. This is a top CIA person who's been, a top advisor on Korea Matters. So that would be kind of what I think, the worst case scenario would be. The most likely scenario is that I think Donald Trump will win, but all the negative things about Trumpism will amplify. I think the pro-Israel stuff, the pro-police stuff, the anti-immigrant stuff will amplify.
Project 2025.
Yeah, the government will try to, the powers that be will try to ride the wave of Trumpism to push forward their own agenda, which is not good. But I do think there is a third possible scenario, which is a real long shot. It's a real long shot, which is that Donald Trump takes office in a completely defensive position. And under those circumstances, he may be compelled to do a lot of good things because he's just at odds with the establishment and needs popular support so much. So we shall have to see. But those are my three predictions. But in all of those circumstances, an anti-imperialist organization, a network of people that are committed to anti-imperialism and building a new America beyond the rule of bankers and war profiteers is going to be vitally important. And at the end of the day, what really matters is not so much who is in office, it's what the balance of forces is in the country and around the world, and what kind of movement exists, what kind of organizations there are of people that are involved in the political process and trying to change the world and taking responsibility for the future of their country. And I wrote the book, as a textbook for the Center for Political Innovation, my organization, as we try to do just that, as we try to build a network of people who can rely on each other and build an anti-imperialist movement in the United States to support the Uhuru Three, to study these ideas, to be out there. That is one thing we aim to do. If Donald Trump wins the election, one thing that we aim to do is we intend to get that picture of Donald Trump shaking hands with Kim Jong-un and get it everywhere and say that this election is a mandate that the peace talks on the Korean Peninsula should continue. Right. And that could be a way to nudge the discourse toward a more peace-oriented wing of Trumpism. That's one thing that we intend to do. We have other operations that we intend to carry out with the aim of nudging the country in an anti-colonial direction. One thing that I think is very important is Alaska. Right. Alaska, is right there close to Russia. And there's the Bering Strait that separates Russia and Alaska. And Abraham Lincoln had the idea of building a bridge to connect Alaska to Russia. And a lot of great people have had the idea of doing that since. And I think popularizing the idea of building a world land bridge to connect Alaska to Russia and pivot the U.S. economy toward trading with the Russian Far East and with the Korean Peninsula and with China, that could nudge the world in a direction of multipolarity, pivot away from Western Europe and towards the World Land Bridge and the Bering Strait and all of that. So there are various things that we can do to try and influence discourse. But I must say, the explosion is coming, right? I mean, it's you can feel it rumbling in the ground. The avalanche is going to pour. The volcano is going to go off. It's only a matter of time. Those of us who study these ideas and understand things, we have the job not of making the explosion come, but rather of trying to guide it in the right direction. The conditions in this country are getting worse. Americans are angry at the establishment. Things are going to change. But what we hope to do is guide that change and point it in a good direction toward a better world. And that's all we can really hope to do. I quote, Mao, the leader of the Chinese Revolution. He said, the masses are the real heroes. And at the end of the day, it will be the masses of the American people in their millions who determine what the future of this country will be. I think they are going to awaken and take action. The question is only what type of action will that be? And I think guys like you and I have a role to play in shaping what kind of action they might take when they do awaken.
Well, thank you for putting me in that group. And, if we are able to build a bridge across the Bering Strait between Alaska and Russia, I'm sure Sarah Palin will be the first one. Should be operating the toll booth. My brother.
All right.
My brother Caleb Maupin, man, thank you so much for being my guest. Thank you so much for joining the show today.
Sure thing. Always a pleasure.
Folks, thank you so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. Stay tuned for new episodes every week. Also, follow us on social media. The Patreon account is very, very important. That helps to support the effort. You can find all the links below in the show description. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See you again next time. Until then, I'm Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a great one. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.